tonight. High alert. Explosions outside the Ukrainian capital, even after peace talks, and a Russian promise to reduce combat operations around Kyiv.
Their intention is to reposition forces.
Plus, Republicans call on the DOJ to take back a memorandum connecting school board protesters to domestic terrorism. All this and more tonight on Faith Nation. Russia fails to deliver on a pledge to scale back attacks in Ukraine. Good evening in Washington, I'm Jenna Browder. Optimism over a possible ceasefire is waning as Russian shelling near the Ukrainian capital city of Kyiv continues, despite claims the Kremlin would scale back their invasion of the area. Meanwhile, new intel suggests Russian President Vladimir Putin may not be getting the full story from his military advisors. National security correspondent Caitlin Burke explains in tonight's top story.
A communications breakdown in Moscow could be keeping President Putin in the dark about the effects his war is having on Russia. New U.S. intel suggesting his advisors are afraid to tell him the truth.
According to recently declassified reports, Putin is unaware that his military has been using conscripts or troops forced to enlist and taking heavy losses. He's also not getting the full picture of how economic sanctions are damaging the Russian economy. This new intel comes a day after Russia promised to scale back operations in certain parts of Ukraine, a pledge U.S. officials regard with skepticism.
I don't read anything into it until I see what their actions are. We'll see if they follow through on what they're suggesting.
There is what Russia says, and there's what Russia does. We're focused on the latter. And what Russia is doing is the continued brutalization of Ukraine and its people. And that continues as we speak.
The Pentagon does see signs of Russian troops withdrawing from Kyiv, but warns that movement is likely more designed to bolster forces in the eastern part of the country. As the war drags on, the number of people forced to leave their homes continue to grow.
Today we crossed the 4 million mark. I think it's a tragic milestone. It means that in less than a month, or in just about a month, 4 million people have been uprooted from their homes, from their families, their communities, in what is the fastest exodus of refugees moving in recent history.
President Biden spoke again today with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. According to Zelensky, the two discussed defensive support needed, new sanctions, and the various types of aid Ukraine is requesting. Caitlin Burke, CBN News.
All right, thank you, Caitlin. And Tony Perkins is the president of the Family Research Council and a commissioner at the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, and he joins us now. Tony, welcome. It's great to have you with us this evening. So USCIRF has warned of the potential of significant religious oppression in Ukraine if the Russian invasion does continue. How could Russian troops target religious communities?
Well, Jen, I think part of the issue here is you look at what's been trending in Russia for the last few years, and it's been trending in the wrong direction. In fact, last year, USCIRF recommended to the State Department that Russia be declared a country of particular concern because of their religious abuse and intolerance, and in fact, they were listed as a country of particular concern. That's been moving in that direction. So I almost think that as we look globally at these countries, that we see this rise of authoritarianism, attack on religious freedom, religious minorities, that could be an early warning sign of even more egregious things to come. You look at Vladimir Putin looking across his border to Ukraine, a country that has embraced religious freedom. It is one of the countries in Eastern Europe that enjoys religious freedom, and as a result, we know there's a growing body of research that says religious freedom results in economic freedom, greater social stability, and that stands in stark contrast to where Russia is at. And so as they move into those areas, and we already have seen this back in 2013, 2014, as they've set up in eastern Ukraine, those areas that are influenced and governed by these breakaway states, they are persecuting religious minorities. So if Russia gains more control over Ukraine, there'll only be an increase in this religious persecution.
We know Vladimir Putin says the invasion into Ukraine serves to denazify the country. Tony, what do you make of that rhetoric?
It's rhetoric. It is an attempt to try to skew what is happening here, or to cloud the real villain. Look, Vladimir Putin has increasingly been persecuting his own people when it comes to religious freedom. And if you deviate at all from the Orthodox state religion that they have in Russia, you are increasingly being pushed to the outskirts. And so, again, it stands as a contrast. Ukraine stands as a contrast in terms of a place of religious freedom and prosperity. And so how do you counter that? Well, you have to begin to spin it, and that's what Vladimir Putin has been doing.
Just a few seconds left, Tony, but is the U.S. doing enough to help the humanitarian crisis there?
Well, I think you certainly see it among the nonprofits, the NGOs. They are doing a lot, and the American people are giving a lot. I think the government is doing a fair job, although I am concerned about where they're prioritizing. If this administration has talked about refugees, they're prioritizing journalists and LGBTQ community members. They're not focusing on the religious individuals who are being persecuted for their faith. So again, we see an administration that has their priorities backwards.
All right, Tony Perkins, on behalf of USurf tonight, great to see you, Tony. Thank you.
Good to be with you.
Meanwhile, it looks like Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson will have bipartisan support in her confirmation to the U.S. Supreme Court. Today, picking up one key Republican vote, Senator Susan Collins of Maine announcing she plans to vote yes. It's widely believed Jackson has the nomination locked up with support from all 50 Democratic senators. But the administration is working to get Republican support to emphasize the historic significance of the first black woman nominated to the high court. Jackson's confirmation vote could come as early as next Friday. In economic news, the U.S. is nearing a recession if one always right indicator is right again. The bond market flashing a warning sign that's correctly predicted almost every recession over the past 60 years. An inversion of the U.S. Treasury note yield curve. This is often seen as a sign investors are feeling nervous about the immediate future. Uncertainty over the war in Ukraine and additional federal interest rate hikes sending investors rushing to buy government-backed bonds. This causing the longer-term return to fall lower than the short-term yield. For more, let's bring in Stephen Skaggy, Chief Investment Strategist at Keel Point. Stephen, welcome. So essentially, if the rate of return on a 10-year Treasury note backed by the U.S. government is lower than that of a 2-year Treasury note, that is bad news, and that's what we saw happen Tuesday. How significant of a marker is that, and do you think we are headed for a recession?
Well, first, thank you for inviting me back, Jen. It's always great to be with you. It certainly is a marker when we see this inversion in the yield curve between 2-year Treasuries and 10-year Treasuries. The situation right now is a little bit unusual, with the Fed having been such a dominant player in the market, and now having announced that it's going to increase short-term interest rates from basically 0 to almost 2% by the end of this year, maybe more if inflation is more pernicious than they currently think, and the fact that the Fed has been buying mortgage-backed securities and Treasury securities that has kept these longer-term rates unusually low. So it's a little bit hard to decipher exactly what's going on. But as you point out, it's right to be cautious about this. As to whether I think that, yes?
Oh, I'm sorry. Please keep going.
Well, thank you, Jenna. Just in answer to the second part of your question, I don't think that we're headed for a recession. When we look at all the other indicators around us, the news is actually quite positive. I mean, first and foremost, COVID receding and people getting back to work, having had several months now of great job growth numbers, and another one expected tomorrow Friday with new jobs in March up between 450 and 500,000 for the month. That's really good news. With COVID down and parents being able to get back to work and coming back into the workforce, That's also really good news. So the forecast ranges between 2.8% growth in 2022 from the Fed to consensus among market economists of about 3.5%. With commodity prices rising, we also have another good signal that markets are expecting growth, positive growth, and not declining growth.
We just have a few seconds left here, but the U.S. GDP last year jumped by a rate of 5.7%, the fastest growth since 7.2%. Is that a good sign, or is it a signal that the economy is overheating? Just about 30 seconds.
Well, number one, it's in part a reflection of rebounding from what happened to us in 2020. So the 5.7, it's a great number, but there's a lot of things that have gone into that. Second, the forecast for 2022 is not to repeat that, but to come in the neighborhood of 3%, which is not really overheating. And when we look at capital expenditures to make up
All right, Steve. I'm sorry I have to cut you off there. We're out of time tonight, but we'll have you on again soon. Steve Skanke with the Keel Point. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jenna.
The parents speaking out at school board meetings get called domestic terrorists. How some GOP lawmakers are calling on the Justice Department to end the labeling. When Faith Nation returns. Stop labeling outspoken parents as domestic terrorists. That's the message some Republican lawmakers have for the Department of Justice. 8 senators have signed a new letter calling on Attorney General Merrick Garland to rescind an October memo that came after the National School Board Association called some parents domestic terrorists. Although the memo doesn't actually use those words, the group of senators says it targets parents who speak out. The letter reads, quote, "Our country is experiencing an uptick in actual violent crime. Several of our major cities hit new homicide records in 2021. Illicit drugs are flowing across our border and into our communities. But instead of cracking down on crime, you decided to target parents advocating for their children. This, no doubt, continues to have a chilling effect on parents' participation at school board meetings, as parents are afraid to attend these meetings for fear of being investigated." Senator Mike Braun of Indiana was one of the 8 Republicans who signed the letter. Capitol Hill correspondent Matt Galka got a chance to speak with him earlier today. Matt, why did senators decide to send a letter now?
Well, Jenna, from their point of view, they believe Attorney General Merrick Garland should have already rescinded his memo from October. But the words used, the comparison to domestic terrorists for parents at school board meetings, those words were actually used by the National School Boards Association before that group apologized and walked it back. Attorney General Merrick Garland denied ever using that term this past fall, so I asked Senator Braun if it was fair to pin that on Garland. He said it was.
And I think yes, because I think Garland needs to be held accountable because he's kind of the chief enforcement officer across the country when it comes to making a stand on an issue like that. And some would say that is not necessary. Some of us think it is.
Now, Senator Braun agreed there was a stark difference between parents having the right to express concerns at school boards and extremism and threats that have come down on some school board members across the country.
Matt, are there broader political implications from this letter and the standoff with the Attorney General?
Well, there definitely could be, and we've probably already seen some of that at the state level. The Virginia governor's race is viewed as largely being decided by parental rights issues, something Senator Braun thinks could play out on a national stage, especially in a midterm election year.
And I think that as long as there's a perception that the federal government is generally backing a point of view where the priority would be in other places and not at least giving parents an equal say-so, you're going to have that out there as an issue. And I think that was reflected politically, in Virginia. And I think that it will going forward until you get some formality along the lines of this letter to where they back off a little bit.
Now, there's no doubt this is still a hot-button issue nationally, but beyond the letter, there's not much legislatively that can be done. But Braun said it was a way to turn up the heat on the issue.
Big news out today, Matt, of course, Senator Susan Collins of Maine becoming the first Republican to say she'll support Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson to the Supreme Court. Where does Senator Braun fall on that.
Well, even with one, they're going to call it bipartisan. But he said he's probably not going to support her, at least for now. He did tell me he believed Judge Jackson is well qualified for the job, but didn't think there would be many other Republicans beyond Senator Collins voting for Judge Jackson's confirmation.
You know, I think sometimes you got to look at the individual that's voting. It depends on who he or she is representing, because you always need to take that into consideration. And I think the fact that she and maybe a couple other senators are generally on the Republican side, the ones that do consider that broader context, I think it's going to be lucky to go much beyond that.
Now, Senator Braun said he'd be sitting down with Judge Jackson later this week to hear her out ahead of the confirmation vote next week. Jenna?
All right, great interview. Matt Galka, Capitol Hill correspondent, thank you so much. And what the race for Ohio's governor could mean for this year's midterm elections and the future of the GOP. That's next on Faith Nation. Welcome back. The Biden administration launched a new website today to help in the fight against coronavirus. COVID.gov points to where you can find free masks, vaccines, testing, and treatments.
You'll also be able to find our new Test to Treat locations, which I announced in my State of the Union address. These are pharmacies and other places in your neighborhood where you can get tested, and if you're positive, you can get life-saving treatments all in one stop.
The launch of COVID.gov comes as federal funding to fight the virus begins to run low. Free testing and treatments for the uninsured patients have already stopped in some clinics and hospitals as government reimbursement money is running out. Federal funding for free vaccines for the uninsured is set to run out next week. President Biden today called on Congress to authorize more money in the fight against COVID. To the November elections in races across the country, Republican incumbents are facing primary challenges from within their own party. What happens in those races could be a sign of where the party is headed. Heather Sells reports on the GOP governor's race in Ohio.
Governor Mike DeWine is running for re-election, but standing in his way, a wave of challengers closely aligned with former President Trump. It is an inter-party battle that mimics the divide in the national GOP. Mike DeWine has served Ohio as a U.S. congressman, senator, and now governor. He sat down with CBN News to talk about his re-election bid and one of the highlights of the last year.
Well, it was a great victory to get Intel here.
In December, chipmaker Intel announced a $20 billion complex near Columbus, the state's biggest economic development package ever. DeWine says it sends a signal.
If you're thinking about moving or you're thinking about expanding, you need to look at Ohio.
As of last month, DeWine also had big money, $9 million in the bank to appeal to voters before the May 3rd primary and beyond. Right now, he's well ahead in the polls with 34 and even 40%, giving him up to an 18-point lead over his challengers, former Congressman Jim Renacci and farmer Joe Blystone.
People are tired. They're looking for somebody on the outside.
I see a state in Ohio that is does not have strong leadership.
Despite trailing DeWine in fundraising and the polls, Renacci and Blystone see an opening. They're counting on primary voters who identify more with Trump-style republicanism, and they're hoping for a Trump endorsement.
I do believe that in Ohio, we're not a Republican state, we're a Trump state.
And one thing I'll say forcefully, President Trump is still my president. I don't think Biden won this past 2020 election.
DeWine says he'd welcome a Trump endorsement, even though he's not been afraid to call him out. On January 7th, after the Capitol riots, DeWine went after the president.
This incendiary speech yesterday that he gave to the protesters served only to fan those flames.
Renacci has targeted DeWine for that, while both he and Blystone are attacking the governor's COVID policies. Ohio was the first state to cancel a large event and close schools, and DeWine has faced criticism for closing businesses and his mask orders.
We're tired of the mask mandates. that this governor was pushing.
Blystone, who farms and owns a restaurant, says the governor's orders forced him to close for 8 weeks.
My employees rely on me to receive a paycheck so they can take care of their families, and when we have to shut down and we can't carry them through, that bothers me a lot.
These three candidates do share similar views on Republican priorities, be it the economy, schools, immigration, abortion, or gun laws. And they're very aware that in these polarized times, politics as usual will not suffice when it comes to governing.
It used to be, at least if you were right or left or middle, we could at least sit down and have a cup of coffee and have a conversation.
I had friends on both sides of the aisle, but I also believe that friendship means that you have to have the ability to be able to talk and work in a civil manner. And I'm hoping we can get back to that.
DeWine, despite tangling with Trump, says it's time to look forward.
I think it's important for us to focus on the 2022 race.
He's also upbeat about bringing the country back together.
We're a resilient people. We're strong people. So, we're going to be okay. We just have to continue to remind ourselves that, what pulls us together as a people is much, much more than what divides us.
How the candidates position themselves in relation to the former president could mean everything in this race, with the stakes especially high in this battleground state. Reporting in Columbus, Heather Sell, CBN News.
Finally tonight, many Ukrainians are using their unique skill sets to help serve their country as Russia wages war. One celebrity chef there says when the invasion started, he knew he wouldn't be good with a gun, but instead a knife. Using his knife skills to help feed the front lines, famous chef Yevgen Klopotenko is serving up free food to Ukrainian troops from his flagship restaurant in Kyiv, and also helping make sure refugees in Lviv have meals. The chef says his mission in life is to feed people. And we'll leave it on that note this evening. Thank you for joining us. Have a great night.